morning and good afternoon and welcome. For those who don't know me, I am Patty Silverstein, the director of APA LA. I am very happy to be here today as the moderator for this event with our APA LA board member, Dennis Dunbar. Before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsor Sammy's Camera. I would also like to remind everyone that our annual Off the Clock curated photo competition is open for submissions right now. This year's top 100 images will be selected by Paul Martineau, the curator of photographs at the Getty Museum. Included in his selections this year will be 3 Best in Show images. Information to submit your work is on our website at apa-la.org. I will also post the link in the chat area as well. Deadline for entering is March 31st, coming up. Just a few more things before we get started. Please stay muted during the presentation. We will have specific points open for questions throughout and then again at the end. You can put your questions in the chat area. I will read those off to Dennis. And then at the end, we'll open it up for you to unmute yourself and show yourself as you ask a question to Dennis. Now on to Retouching Secrets. A bit about Dennis. As the guy who adds the Photoshop magic to movie posters and images for ad campaigns, Dennis Dunbar loves working on cool images with cool creatives. Dennis's work as a digital artist retoucher is all about collaboration. Since 1991, he has been working with top photographers and art directors to create compelling images for the advertising and entertainment industries, with projects ranging from posters for top Hollywood movies to national ad campaigns for major clients. His approach as a collaborator is to make it easy for his clients to realize their vision in creating the finished art. With that, I'll introduce Dennis Dunbar. Dennis.
Hello.
Take it away.
Hello, how are you doing?
Great.
I'm going to switch my view over here to gallery so I'm not so just distracted by seeing myself big or whatever like that. Happy to be here with you guys. Glad to be able to share some tips and all that. And looks like we got a nice crowd of people coming in for that. So hopefully I can share something useful for you guys. The whole idea about this is to give you a few ideas and tips and things that maybe you can use to play with, in your own work and pick up a couple of things that'll help you down the road for this. And the idea is normally when I'm doing a presentation is sort of like a workflow, like a portrait retouching workflow or compositing and masking workflow. This one's going to be sort of like a top 10 or so favorite retouching tricks for that. So it might be a little jumping around or whatever, but hopefully there's something in there you like. And if you have a question about something, I love getting questions for this. So Patty wants you to post any of your questions to the chat. And then when Patty has a chance, she'll say, oh, Dennis, John has a question about this. Can you go back over that or whatever like that? So we'll do that. And then at the end, I think around 10:30 or around 11:30 or so, we'll have a thing where everybody can come back on and ask their question and we can have a little more direct back and forth or whatever like that. But, please don't hesitate to post your questions about things. That's what really helps me know I'm guiding you along and aiming the presentation in the right way, whatever. So with that, I'm going to switch over to share my screen, and I'm going to switch over to that. And whoop, I got to move stuff out of the way. Okay, so I'm just moving a few things out of the way here so I can see. And here you should see, can everybody see my screen here? The shot of the woman? Okay, no, nobody. Oh, I'm seeing a couple of yeses, whatever. I realize everybody's muted. I'm waiting to hear people talk like, oh, wait, yep. Okay, great. Just want to make sure everybody can see this for that. So one of the first things I wanted to show you, a real easy trick that came up. And one of the things I do when I'm learning is I study other people's work. I look at other people's work and have some friends, that we share tips and things. But one of the retouchers whose work I really like is this guy, Jeff Whitlock. And he does a lot of stuff for like Kramer Johnson and all that. Jeff's a really nice guy. So I'm jealous as heck, but I can't be mad at him for taking clients I really want to work with because he's such a nice guy. And Jeff really does a lot of work with color grading. And so I was looking at some of his color grading on this and wondering, like, he had a really great way of just putting an interesting color into the highlights for something like that, and for an image, for like a portrait or like that. And he was just having a little bit of a contrasting color in the highlights, which I thought really added depth to the image. So I thought, how could I create that? And all of a sudden it hit me that there's a really easy way to do this. So that's what I'm going to show you with this portrait. This portrait is by a photographer. Okay, I'm not trying to rasterize that. This portrait is by a photographer, Jay Mayhew. She's a really great photographer. I haven't met her in person, but I love her work, and she seems to really know what she's doing. I think she's based in Texas somewhere, if I have it right, for that. But when I was playing around with this technique, I was looking at Jay's stuff and like, hey, Jay, can I play with some of your images? I'd really like to try something. She said, sure, go ahead. Send me some images to play with for that. So that's what I did with this. So this is the shot Jay had photographed of this older woman, whatever. And I thought, what if I added some of this contrasting color into the highlight center? And it's a subtle little approach. Hopefully you guys can see it as I toggle it on and off. It's a subtle little touch, but just a little bit of cool color in the highlights of her hair and on her cheeks or whatever, I found added a really interesting depth. So I'm going to show you guys how I did that and how easy it is to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn off this little layer where we had done that. We're on the layer for the woman. I'm going to use the eyedropper tool, and I'm going to sample the color of the shadow. So I'm clicking in here, and you see this here is showing the color of the shadow on her face. As I click around, you should see this moving around or whatever like that. But I'm looking for the color of the shadow, specifically under the hue, saturation, brightness. I'm looking for the hue angle. So the hue angle is going to be the red, green, blue, whatever component. And then you have saturation and brightness for that. So the hue angle is 12 for this. So I want to put the opposite color into the highlights. So the opposite color, easy way to do this is 360-degree angle, 360 degrees on the hue wheel. So we add 180 to the hue, and that will give us the opposite hue. So we have 12. So we're going to click on here. We're going to go to 192. See if I type that in correctly. And that gives us sort of a cool blue color. Now, we're not worried about how dark or light it is because we're just going to be using this as a color thing. So color is going to pick up the hue and the saturation for that, for this. So we can tweak this again a little later if we want to, but this gives us the basic color we're going for. So it's a nice, cool color. So we click that, and now our foreground color you can see is this. So I'm going to come up here. I am going to go to layer. I'm going to go fill and solid. I'm going to go color fill. Yes, I'm going to set this down to color. Color blending is going, not luminosity, no, color. Color blending gives us hue and saturation. It can affect the lightness and darkness at all for this. So that's exactly what we're going to want to do here. So we're going to add that in. And now you see, okay, this is way too strong. We can close this. This is way too strong, but it's got that nice, cool blue color on it. So the first thing I'm thinking about is I don't want it everywhere. I just want it in the highlights for her. How am I going to do that? So the easy way to do that is you double click next to the name, and it brings up this dialog box. And here you can add layer styles. You can add all kinds of stuff. But these things down here, the blend if sliders. That's where the magic is. This is where we want to do. So for this one, you have this layer, which is our blue layer. And we're not going to want to worry about playing around with the blue layer right now. It's the underlying layers, the way it interacts with the layers below that we want to worry about. If we take this slider and pull it up, you see this is starting to bring it out. So this keeps it from affecting the darker tones. And we slide this up to wherever we want. If we slide this one down, it works the opposite way. It protects the lighter tones. So we're going to slide this way up here. I'm looking at like things like here, right around in here. I'm looking to see, I just want a little bit of this coming in here. Okay, so we've got that, but it's looking kind of harsh. It'd be really nice if we could get this to feather out and get a nicer blend for that. So I hold down the Option key. I can't show you the Option key on the screen here, but I hold down the Option key, and then that allows me to split these triangles. And now the more we have the triangle split, the more of a feathering action we get. So we can visually see this. There's no numbers you have to worry about. It's just all visual based here. So we just kind of visually see how it goes, like, okay, that's kind of a nice effect. For this, we go, okay, that's nice, but it's too strong. Of course it's too strong. So we're going to turn down the opacity. And again, this is all kind of visual based. I'm going to leave it a little bit stronger for this video than I normally would, because when we're doing something across the web and you want to see it, you want to make sure you can see clearly enough what's going on. But this is an easy way. I don't have to mask anything out. I don't have to make a luminosity mask or any sort of thing. Just in a few seconds, I can add a contrasting color in there. And then if I want to mask it out, of course, I can always click here on the layer mask. I can go to my brush tool. I can make my foreground color black, and I can paint it out of all these areas here. I can paint it out of her hair if I wanted to. I can do anything I want with the layer mask, and that's completely editable as well. So that's a really easy thing to do. So the first tip is the blend if sliders for that. Now I talked about blend if sliders for affecting the way it mixes with the colors below. For another example, let's make a new layer here. Gonna make a new layer. I'm just going to call this grad. And I'm going to go to my gradient tool. And let's set this to black and white. So the gradient here is going to add a black to white gradient. We're just going to add that straight across here. And we got this black to white gradient. Great. So the blend if sliders, here we have under, so we can play around with, like we just did with the underlying layers. For this layer here, you can see how we can affect this and kind of affect the way this stuff goes for that. So it gives you an idea about how this layer, how working with this layer or underlying layer works in this case for that. I don't have a particular idea in mind right now about why I would do it this way, but it's entirely possible, and it's something that you can work out, and it's all visual based, so you kind of see the way it goes. But there are certain times I wouldn't do this with a gradation, but I might do it with something else where I just want to tickle in a little bit of something, or have a vignette effect or some sort of thing like that for it. So this is what I wound up going with as the final thing for her. This was, if we double click on this had 188, so I sampled slightly different. So the hue is just about the same thing as what we had before, but it's a little bit lighter version of it. Again, that shouldn't matter in terms of the color, because lightness of the color doesn't matter. It's the hue and the saturation which are going. And then we had 30% opacity on the layer for that. So it's just a little bit of a hint of contrasting color. And I find quite often that just adds a nice depth to the portrait or to the shot for that. So I use that a fair amount when I'm working on portraits. Now, I wouldn't use it on like a corporate portrait or something, more straight up, but something where you're trying to give it a little more of a artistic feel or whatever, I would do that. So hopefully that's going along. Everybody seems to be going along. I'm not seeing a lot of questions pop up, so that's great. So let's move on to the next trick. And the next trick, this is a shot I worked on for Anthony next. Anthony's a great photographer, a great friend, very generous guy. I tell everybody, if you're a photographer in LA, you have to get to know Anthony because he's such a wealth of resources and stuff like that. So I love working on Anthony's work and helping him out with that stuff. So in this particular case, what this was, if I come to my, come over here and open this up, Anthony had a lot of shots of these different razors that he shot like this. So this one is just one where I'm just experimenting with changing the color around. I'm going to use that for something right after I show you this thing. But this is basically what Anthony did. He had all these shots like this and said, oh, I want them composited around in an array. And part of the question was like, well, had this beautiful shadow thing. How am I going to add the shadow in without having to do a lot of masking? And one of the cool tricks is, it works really well if it's photographed on white. You can use it if it's photographed on light gray as well. There's a way you can steal the shadow from here, and you don't have to repaint the shadow. You don't have to carefully mask anything out or whatever. So that's what we were doing here. So you can see we have, these are all organized in layer groups here. This top one, if I can get it to open, if it responds to my clicking, here we go. We have the razors. These are all the razors on top. And then we have the shadows. And these are all the shadows below. So let's turn off this layer group. And let's go to this layer group. So let's see. I'm going to slide down here. I'm going to turn off everything except just this one so that it's easier for us to pay attention to. There we go. So we just have this one thing here. So what I've got is, if I put this onto normal blending and turn this layer mask off and turn this off, this is what our shot is. So the shot's placed in, it's just a copy of the same shot as for the razor. So it's the same one here. I turned off the layer mask. I got rid of the layer mask for that once I placed the razor in, and we put this in here. So this is set. If I change this to darken or to multiply blending mode, either one in this case works. But if I set this to darken blending mode, then it should be anything that's darker than the white is going to show up. Great, except I don't want all this background stuff showing up here. I want to get rid of that. So that's where you add a adjustment layer. I'm going to open this up, and you see this adjustment layer. It's a curves adjustment layer. It's clipped to here. So it's using a clipping group to only affect this layer here. It's not going to affect anything below there. And all I've done is just push the white values over so the white disappears. And you kind of have to visually watch because you can see how we can make our shadow disappear here. So this is about where I had that set. I'm getting a little bit of corner action here happening. So I use a layer mask to get rid of it all the other places or whatever like that. But this just allowed me to just add in just a layer, and I didn't have to carefully mask anything. I just was able to push the values for what I didn't want to white and then capture this. So especially since this had color in it, that worked out really well because painting something like this would be really next to impossible for that. So we add all these back in. Okay. I'm going to come over to my history palette, click back on open, because once I start turning layers on and off, I get mixed up about which ones are on, which ones are off for this. So this is how we added all the shadows for that. Each one of these had their own shadow. Where is this? Come on, let's turn off this. I'm losing track of where I am. Oh, I made a shadow. I made a copy of the shadow. There we go. I made a copy of that layer group. Okay, so you can see how each one of these just built up, and each one has the same adjustment layer. Every time I added one, I just copy that adjustment layer to it, copy that adjustment layer to that, and made that go. So that was a pretty easy thing to do. The other thing I want to show you with this is you'll notice each one of these layers has this funny little icon here. So this is this shows that it's a smart object. And smart objects are super cool things for Photoshop. For this, I'm going to close this properties palette here for a moment. Smart objects are a super cool function in Photoshop, and I use them an awful lot. So what a smart object does is it takes your original file and embeds all that data into the layer. So if I make this, if I take this and I make it bigger and smaller, if I add a Gaussian blur to it, if I add a filter to it, if I rotate it, whatever, it's always going back and calculating again and again from the original data. So if I make it smaller and they go, wait a minute, what am I thinking? I need to make that bigger. And I make it a lot bigger. It's not making the small one bigger. It's going back and calculating from the original one and giving me the best result possible. Also, filters run on smart objects are editable. So let's see, we have this layer here. I'm going to turn off the shadows just for a moment, just so it's easy to see. So we have this one here. So let's go and add Gaussian blur to this. Gaussian blur, and let's add a huge amount of Gaussian blur. Now I have a layer mask for it, so let's turn off the layer mask so you can see that. You're like, okay, what was I thinking? That's way too much Gaussian blur. Where you see the filter pops up here, I can double click on this filter and I go, wait a minute, I don't need to add that much. I can tone it down and then click OK, and there I've got less blur. If I decide that was a stupid idea, I don't want any blur, okay, I turn the smart filter off, I can throw the smart filter out, I can do whatever I want with that. I can copy this smart, I can turn this smart filter on. I can turn the smart filter on. Okay, for some reason it's not letting me turn it back on. I always love it when that happens. I was going to say I can copy that smart filter to other objects. And there we go. I can hold down the, let's turn this layer back on. I can hold down the Option key and I can copy this filter to object after object after object. So I can have them all do that, and I can turn them all off and think like, good. You don't have to think about such crazy things. So the one thing I wanted to show you, the other thing I wanted to show you about this was this yellow one. Let's find this yellow one. That's this layer here. So what I just did was I hold down the Control key. I'm on a Mac. So if you guys are on a PC, I'm sorry, I don't speak PC that great, but on the Mac, if you hold down Control and Command and click on a layer, this little pop-up will tell you all the layers that are active on that thing. So it helps you find the right layer for this. So, okay, so we go to this one, this yellow one here. And suppose we decided instead of the yellow one, we wanted to have a different color for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a cool trick. We're going to come here. We've got this one selected. I'm going to come up here to Layer and Smart Object and Replace Contents. That's what I want. Smart Edit, Smart Layer, Replace Contents. And I'm going to navigate to, I'm going to navigate to my folder. And I am going to go to here and I find the one I want to use. So I select this other thing and it will take a moment and pop in, and it pops in the same place, the same size, the same rotation. It's automatic for that. So that's a really cool way. Like instead of the yellow one, we want the green one, or we want this turquoise one. It allows me to pop that in and replace that. This is something that I use quite a lot when working on movie posters. And this was a tip a friend of mine, Eric Tolliday, who's also a movie poster finisher, came up with. And what the critical thing about that is if the physical dimensions, the inches by inches for your object has to be the same size canvas, the same size object. So if you have the green one like this, if you have shot them, it's all the same razor, and all you've done is shift the colors around, or you've retouched it, or you've gotten rid of something on that, as long as it's the same physical size. The resolution can be different, but as long as the inches, the physical size is the same, it will pop in and replace it exactly. So what Eric has done is with movie poster work, a lot of times the art directors, the designers who are designing the movie posters, work with lower res originals, and so they can work faster, and their files are smaller and they can work really quick. So they'll have something where the shot of the main actor is, you know, maybe 100 DPI, but the high res shot is 400 DPI. Long as they haven't changed the size of the thing and they put it in as a smart object, when we're finishing the poster, we just have to do that replace content smart object trick, and the high res one will pop right in, and we don't have to rescale them and move them around and make it match on that. We get an exact match far more easily. So that's a really cool thing. So I see John is asking, is this possible because of all the controls of the layer state, even if replacing content? Yes, because the smart object, you're basically just replacing the contents of that smart object, and it's going back and like, okay, recalculate from that. So I think that is exactly the way that's working for that. I noticed Joy asked, what's Anthony's last name? It's Anthony Next. Super good guy, great photographer, very great resources, and all that for helping that. So anyways, so those are the first couple of tips for that. Hopefully you guys are getting some cool things from that. I am going to come over here and let's take a step back for a moment. And a couple of things I want to show after we've got those done is I want to show a couple other little things. I'm going to make a new document. And I want to show you one of the things that people get confused a lot about is the difference between opacity and flow for Photoshop. So when it comes to brushes, let's look up here, and I'm going to bring up brushes. I want brush controls, brush settings. Here we go. So brush settings is something that people get kind of confused about. And I want to go over a couple of things with this for that, because this is something I use an awful lot. So when you first have a brush with Photoshop, you will have something like this going on, where when you use a Wacom tablet or use something that's pressure sensitive, you see that it gets harder and softer and bigger and smaller, all with the same sort of thing. So the default brushes for Photoshop have shape dynamics and transfer both turned on. And these are great controls. They allow you to do a lot of stuff with your brushes, but it also can be rather confusing. So when you're first getting started using something like a Wacom tablet or whatever like that, I recommend coming into brush settings and setting up a brush for this, like where you just have transfer turned on. And transfer, I set this to pen pressure, it's opacity jitter. So you can see here in this thumbnail, if I go with a real light touch, you can see that my opacity for this, as I go around here, I'm getting some difference just by the pressure I'm pushing on the tablet here on with the stylus. So that really helps for that. So that's what the transfer setting does. Pen pressure. So it's pen pressure uses to control how much paint is going down. So that's really kind of like you're using a brush. The harder you press down, or you're using a pencil, the harder you press down, the more lead you're going to put down. The lighter a touch, you can get a lighter color, whatever like that. So that's what the transfer setting does. Shape dynamics can be really cool too. Shape dynamics can let you change the size of your brush. So let's. I'm not going to turn on the size here, but I'm trying to go. Maybe I need to go with a smaller brush. I'm trying to option delete. There we go. We got it set back to black. So let's go with a smaller brush and see if I can show you this. Oh yeah, we're getting a little bit of that there. I find this one is a little more difficult to get controlling and all this stuff. So which is why I prefer the transfer setting for that. But that's what happens when you have, oh, that's what happened. I have transfer also turned on. There we go. If I go really light, you can see I can get different sizes or whatever like that. But I find this is much harder to control. So that's why I tend to turn that off and I turn this on. I'll use shape dynamics if I'm doing something where I really got to be careful about things. Why does that keep showing up? There we go. So I will use transfer most of the time for these things. The other thing I wanted to show you is, let's close these things out. I'm going to show you the difference between opacity and flow. So if I have opacity set to 100, I can get 100% opacity with every brush stroke. If I set opacity to 31%, every brush stroke, no matter how far back and forth I go, is only going to be 31% opacity for that. I can go again and again and again and build up, but I have to go again and again. It has a top for that. In any single brush stroke, I can't get more opaque than that for that. So if I come back over here and we set opacity to 100% and flow, let's set flow down to something like 33%. Now, if I start off low and come back and forth, you see I can get something fairly transparent and something more opaque, all in one brush stroke. So this allows me to kind of, just like I would if I were using an airbrush, you know, with a light touch, I'm just getting a little bit, go back and forth and build up the paint, build up the paint, build up the paint. I find this, the more I practice with flow versus opacity, the more flow becomes natural to me. It took a little while for me to transition. It took a little while for me to make the transition towards this, but I really found that flow was a much more natural thing for me once I did get used to that. The other thing is, if I click on this little airbrush icon here, and then I hit a number on my keypad, you can see the flow rate changes. So if I hit 9, it's 90%. If I hit 10, it's 10%. If I hit 05, I get 5%. So that's an easy way to control your flow with that. If this is turned off, then what it does is it affects the opacity for that. So I like to keep I tend to keep my opacity up to 100%, and then I keep this button clicked on, so then I can change my flow rate for that. It depends on what I'm going to do. If I'm burning and dodging, I'm doing something where I really have to be gentle about how I build it up, I will work with a very low flow, like sometimes 5%. I know some people go down to like 1 or 2% flow. It depends on how strong you want to come on or whatever like that. So,
Dennis?
yes.
There is a question from John Milovic. What's an example of when you use this?
Well, I use the flow setting with just about everything these days when I'm using the brush tool for that. But most of the time, the area where it's really effective is like when I'm painting a mask. If I have a low flow and I want to really have a gentle edge, it gives me a chance to paint a mask or adjust the mask with the brush tool that gives me a very, controlled buildup. The other thing is when I'm doing burning and dodging for that. So let me bring up an example about that, because the next thing I wanted to show you is this whole idea about working in layers and way to do portrait retouching, just the power of working in layers. But let's bring this up, and I'm going to add an adjustment layer just to show you how I would use this. I'm going to add an adjustment layer, and I will call this dodge curves. When dodging and burning, I like to use curves adjustment layers. So I will set up one where I lighten it, and then I invert the mask, so I hide that, and then I set up one where I darken it, and then I do the same thing, fill the mask with black, and then I hide that. So now to reveal this effect, if for some reason, my little tool thing over here, come on. I can barely see my foreground background colors. And for some reason, I don't know, there we go. There we go. Okay, now we can see this. So I'm setting white to be my foreground color. I'm going to set my flow down to be 10%. So I hit 1 on my keyboard, and my flow is going to be pretty low for this. And I can come in here with a low brush. Let's make this a little more dramatic so you guys can see. So I'm going to bring this up. So this is about the rate I usually have the dodge layers, usually somewhere around here. But for the purpose of this thing, so you guys can see more clearly, I'm going to show it like this. So you can see here, if I now you see the difference. Now you see that building up. I can build up the effect here for that. So I'd be more careful about how I do this if I'm trying to just quickly show this thing here. But this is a great example when I would use that for that, because burning and dodging is when you're working on portraits, you do a lot of burning and dodging for this. And so this is a little ham-handed, but I wanted to show you really quickly how I do that. Michael's asking, is there a setting so when you brush a new area, you actually overlap previous, it won't increase the amount brushed? No, I don't think there is a setting for that. And that's something I've never come across, because part of the thing is when you're doing this, you want to be able to build it up and build it up and build it up for that. So one thing you can do is, this wasn't one of the tips I had on there, but one of the things that you can do is you can use your history palette and you can use the history brush. So suppose you brushed in your thing here. So let's bring here, and we've brushed brushed in here, and gosh, what will we do for this? Okay, so let's just use this. We're going to really lighten our lips. It's not a move I would make, but we're just going to do that. We're going to go to that. The last thing we did was that one brush state. So this is the history palette. Your history palette, you can set up how many states you want. I usually have it set for like 50 or something like that. It's kind of like a menu of undos. So you can go back at any point in time and do an undo state. So suppose we have this, that I'm going to click the little history state here. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to brush some more, and then I'm going to brush some more. I'm going to brush some more. And I think, wait a minute, I really didn't want to do that over her lips. The area here, I liked what I did. So this little button here is clicked on for this state. And then I go to Y is my history brush. Here's my history brush. The keyboard shortcut is Y for that, but history brush here. And then I can use the history brush to brush back over this area, and it's brushing in that history state for that. So that would take me back. So that's kind of a way to get to what Michael is asking, but I don't think there's a way to protect that area unless you're just making a new layer and go on like that. So hopefully that answers Michael's question with that. I'm trying to throw this out. There we go. Okay, so the thing I wanted to show you with this is, the other thing I was going to show you is this idea about working in layers. And this is a basic tip. It's something I tell a lot of people to do, but this whole idea about when you're working on something, working in layers and building up what you're doing gives you a great deal of control. So when it comes to portraits, one of the first things I'll do is, I recommend when people start out, is just take a moment and make a markup layer and mark for themselves the things that they're observing. Take time to look through your image and kind of give yourself some notes about what you want to get rid of, how you want to do that, what you think needs addressing or whatever like that. It's really super helpful when I get something like this from a client, where they might say like, oh, the wrinkle on this guy's shirt, please remember to clean that up, or the edge of his coat, or any sort of note or whatever like that. It's super helpful for that, because then I know exactly what you're thinking about looking for. But when I'm starting out, when I recommend people doing, when they're starting out and learning how to do retouching, is to go through and make little notes like that for themselves, because it kind of gives you a chance to slow down, and then you have a checklist built into your mind for that. So then when working, my workflow will be, I set up one layer, I call it retouch, and then I use the heal brush, the healing brush, the spot healing tool, the healing brush, and the clone stamp tool to go through and do my retouching for this. So I like to start off with the spot healing brush because I like to do this really simple. We're going to go demo retouch. I don't want to get too caught up in this thing because we got a lot of other tips to go. And I'm already using like half the time available for this. So spot healing brush is really super cool. You can just brush over this thing and you don't have to think about it. It's something that can work really well. The thing you have to look for is if you do this, well, it's doing a good job right now, but sometimes you can lose a little bit of texture. So sometimes if you go over something, you'll find like the texture is just not quite the same here. So if I find I'm losing the texture and I'm not getting what I want, that's when I switch over to the spot healing tool. And then the spot healing tool is kind of picking up texture from another area and depositing on this. And the spot healing tool will do a really good job of paying attention to blending the tones in nicely and keeping your texture and all that. Spot healing, or the healing brush, is really super good for working with skin, in that you can kind of go, I want some of this texture down in here. I want to transition the pores or the texture in the face, whatever like that. So it's really useful for that. With spot healing tool, go to spot healing tool. You want to make sure if you're working on a new layer and there's nothing in that layer, you want to make sure you click on sample all layers. And then you have these different options here. I almost never use create texture. I set mine for content aware quite often, because content aware, if I switch over these areas, it tends to respect the border between light and dark and contrast pretty well. Not perfectly, but it tends to respect that fairly well. So I can brush over things like that and get a pretty good result. But sometimes it's not picking up the texture as much. If I go to proximity match will do a better job at matching the texture. But if I switch over here, I get weird results. So I have to be careful when I'm working over areas like this for that. So I tend to set mine for content aware, but it's just good to know the differences between them. With this healing brush, you want to make sure you set this to current and below. Now, our spot healing brush only has sample all layers. So if you have adjustment layers on top, you have to turn them off if you're going to work below that on a retouching thing. So that's also part of the reason for my workflow, like start off with the retouching, get the retouching done, do the color correction at the end, as opposed to do the color correction on the top and then work underneath the color correction for that. So you just have to remember you have sample all layers. I keep begging Adobe to give us the same options we have here: current and below, current layer, all layers. This would be really great to have that for the spot healing tool, but they don't give us that. So, you know, when I'm working on that, that's how I'm going through doing all this retouching work for this. I will do the basic retouching, and the basic retouch layer is everything that's got to go. Everything in my mind, like, that's absolutely got to go, no question. Just get that cleaned up here. So it's a lot of basic cleanup. It's also a chance to kind of really get in close and be thinking about what's distracting and you know, thinking about the image and all that. Then I'll have another layer for like, okay, it's gonna be a little more challenging to get rid of some of these stray hairs. So this is done with a combination of spot healing, healing brush, clone, paintbrush, done with a combination of that. And then another common thing is retouching under the eyes. So I will do a separate layer for under the eyes. And in this case, the goal is to get the bags on your eyes completely gone, and then use opacity to slide down and adjust that. So in this case, I think I had 40% is what what the client and I decided that looked good. But if the client says, oh, can you back off some more, really lighten the bags on your eyes some more, there, all I have to do is change the opacity, and that goes. Or if they say, whoa, 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 you went way too strong, can you just back off on that? Sure. I change the opacity, back off on it. It's really easy to do. I had an extra layer here for clean up eyes. I might do this in the retouch layer as well, get the veins out of the eyes. And then there's a curved adjustment layer for working on lightening the eyes. Again, this gives me the ability to change the opacity of this and change the effect of this. And then I have a curves adjustment layer for color. So it's just making a little bit of adjustment to the color. And then this one here is adding a little bit of contrast for that. So this is just all working in layers and building up the workflow for that. So working in layers is really great. I see a lot of people say, oh, I do all this work, then I flatten it, then I move on. The problem with that is you're locking yourself into a workflow. If you are the final decision maker and you know absolutely sure there's no way I'm ever going to want to go back from this step, then sure, you can flatten and keep your file size smaller. Since I'm a retoucher, I'm almost never the final decision maker, and I have to have that flexibility built in. So if my clients say, whoa, you went too far, or push this farther, or change that, or can you just adjust this a little bit, I've got all that flexibility built into it. And when you're working on composites or something that's going to be composited, that's always sort of a thing where you're going back and readjusting things, because once you get this into the context or you've changed the background, now all of a sudden the visual context of things change and you have to readjust that and make that look a little bit different as well. So that's the tip about working in layers. I really highly recommend that. Do be sure to name your layers. That's also something that retouchers will talk about a lot, because you know, I worked on this shot for the book with Katrine Eisman that I wrote, and that was like 4 years ago. I opened this up, I still know what each layer was. If this was layer 37 or layer 72, what would I know that what that was for? But now I know it's like, oh, this one's clean up the eyes. Let's get rid of that little veins in the eyes or whatever like that. So that makes it easy for me to know exactly what that layer is about. So working layers and naming your layers is a really important thing for that.
There's a question from John Early. How often do you use frequency separation for portrait beauty retouching?
You know, that's a great question. We don't have time to go into frequency separation here because that's a whole workflow. We could do a 4-hour workshop on frequency separation that I would love to do sometime. So I don't want to get into that because it's such a deep rabbit hole to go down. We'll get lost and we'll come up tomorrow and go, oh yeah, this one's supposed to be a 24-hour workshop, just a 2-hour one. But how often do I use that? It will depend a great deal on what I'm doing. So you can be faster using frequency separation on portrait or beauty retouching, but it's something you have to be really, really careful about. You have to use it like a scalpel, not like a butcher knife. And I see way too many people, especially when they're starting out, using it like a butcher knife, where you've just completely reshaped the person. You've lost the personality of the person. One of the things you have to pay very close attention to, frequency separation is a way of dividing up the color and tone from the detail. And there's a relationship, particularly with skin, between the color and tone and the detail. And so if we change the relationship too strongly, something sticks out in the back of our head. So if you've ever looked at this, if you've ever looked at a shot on Instagram or something like that, then you're like, I see all the pores, but something looks like a China doll about this to me. It's because that person has gone too heavy with their technique, and they've lost that relationship between the skin texture and the underlying color and tonality of that. The tonality, you know, the light and dark and the color for this is always a little variations all around and all that stuff. And as human beings, we are come straight out of the chute, born recognizing faces. We know what's human. Is one of the most innate things with this. So when something breaks that, and we get into that uncanny valley of you know, where it's not quite right and we can't quite put a finger on it, that's when you're making a mistake as a retoucher. So that's why I say you just be super, super careful about it. But I just worked on a series of corporate portraits for that, and we had like 20 of them to get done. And so, you know, I was able to use frequency separation on those and kind of smooth things out. But again, I was being very, very subtle. And most of the reason for using the frequency separation was for smoothing the wrinkles on the clothing. So it's really great for that. But again, I don't want to get too caught up in that because we can dive down that rabbit hole for a long time and get lost for that. So the next thing I'm going to show you is what I call my divide and conquer workflow. And it's my favorite technique for let me see. I got a color. Here we go. Color correction. I'm going to open up a couple of shots here. There we go. So here's a shot for this. I studied Kung Fu for a long time. This guy, Larry, was when the first school I went to, he was a senior student. He graduated and started his own school. So I helped him teach for quite a while. And one of the things Larry thought was really helpful was to have a lot of photographs during class so the students could see for themselves what their form was like, how they're performing and all that. So here he's demonstrating a technique with Stan. Stan is a good friend. He got his black belt right after I got mine. So I'm always the senior guy over Stan. So I always like that part. But anyway, as you can see, that the color in this shot is just a real mess because of the circumstances we're shooting under for that. So the question is, like, how would you color correct this for that? And I was reading a book by a legendary color correction guru, Dan Margulis. And Dan isn't writing a whole lot anymore, but through the 90s and early 2000s, and even in the 2010s, Dan wrote a lot of books, a lot of articles about color correction. It's, pretty safe to say there probably wasn't anybody else in the world that knew as much about color correction as Dan did. And, guy's a great icon. Every once in a great while, I'm fortunate enough to, if I'm out in New York area, I can talk him into getting together for lunch or something like that. So he's become a friend as well. But Dan wrote a book about the LAB color space and color correcting in that. In the LAB color space, you have lightness, and then you have two color channels, A, which is green magenta, and B, which is blue yellow. So you can have, if you bring up a curve adjustment layer, I'm going to bring up the curve adjustment layer, and in the LAB thing, you would have L for lightness, you have A for blue, for green magenta, and then B for blue yellow. And so you could go to the L channel and affect that, and it wouldn't affect your color at all. So you could add contrast without jacking up the colors. You could take red out without changing the tonality of it. And like, wow, what a great workflow. But when I'm working on composite stuff, I don't have the ability to just switch color modes back and forth for that, particularly when a client tells me we need this in this CMYK, or we need a layered file in RGB, or whatever it is they tell me they need a layered file in, for that I have to be able to work within that color space. So my idea was, how do I adapt that idea of working on luminosity on one side and color on another side? I'm like, wait a minute, that's the answer. So if I take a curve adjustment layer here and I make them lighter, you see as I shift this, the color is shifting as well. All I'm doing is taking the RGB channel and trying to make it lighter, but it's getting more yellow and more saturated in the highlights. The yellows get more saturated. If I come down here and make it darker, you can see everything shifting towards more saturated red for that. So like, okay, that's messing things up. So if I come here and I try to adjust this, and like, okay, it's too yellow, so I'm going to add blue. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to add blue to my thing. Well, now I'm making everybody, that's actually not looking too bad, but now I'm making everybody lighter. I don't want to make them lighter. I want to do this. So curves get to be a little bit difficult thing to work with. But what if I throw that out and I make a curve adjustment layer for color curves? And you can see I'm a horrible typist. I'm going to do color curves here, and then I'm going to make another one, and I'm going to call that lum curves. My daughter gave me a hard time. Why are you taking all the time to abbreviate just to save yourself 2 letters? But I told her I'm really that bad of a typist. Anything I can do to cut down the letters I type, the better it is. Okay, so this one's set for luminosity, and this one is set for color. It doesn't matter which one's on top, doesn't matter the order or whatever. I just tend to do the color and then luminosity, but you can do any way you want. So now if I come over here and make this lighter, you can see the saturation, the color's not changing. If I make it darker, same thing, the saturation of the color doesn't change at all. So we can kind of lighten this up a little bit. Actually, what I kind of want to do is maybe open up the shadows a little bit and take a little bit of the contrast out. So we're just going to kind of do that, but it's really the color we want to go to. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on the color one. The most obvious thing is blue. Let's add some blue here. That's not bad. Maybe I'll add a little bit of red in. I'm going to click here, add a little bit of red. I'm like, okay, that's not bad. And pretty easily I was able to go from this to this. So for the demo thing, this is what I wound up working up. Luminosity curve, a little more gentle than what I originally, than what I just did now. And then the color curve, well, the color curve was moving the white point for the blue over and just adjusting the blue, whatever, for that. But that was a really simple way to do the color correction for this. I'm going to show you this shot. This is something David Zeitz let me use as a demo for this sort of shot for that. So this is a purposely, whacked out color shot for this. And we're going to turn these layers off. So what I've done, we have these layers already set up and no adjustment made in them. So what I did was I added a gradient here so you can see what happens. So this is a desaturated gradient because if it was already saturated and we increase saturation, you wouldn't be able to see that quite so clearly. For that. So I got to try to speed up a little bit because I'm noticing we're coming up on 11 o'clock and then I'm only showing you 3 things for this. So let's come over here and we got the color curves. And the thing I wanted to show you with the color curves is for this shot here, if I just pull down the saturation a little bit, if I pull down the white point, I'm desaturating the shot. You can see in our little gradient here thing here, we're desaturating this. But actually, we just pull down the saturation. This lady looks fine. So when we're thinking here, the color is really horrible. If she's too warm and too yellow and stuff, it's actually just sort of a saturation issue. Like, oh, that's interesting. So I can decrease saturation by pulling this down. How would I increase saturation? Well, if this is a contrast curve for adding contrast to it, contrast in the color, in a color channel, is adding saturation. So I can add saturation this way by adding a gentle S curve in for this. I can set this back to 0. I can pull this midpoint up and visually I can see like, okay, we're getting more saturation in the shadows, a little less in the highlights. If I pull down here, we're getting more saturation in the highlights than we are in the shadows. So that's interesting. This is something I could not do with the hue saturation thing. I can do this with hue saturation. I can do this with hue saturation, but I cannot easily affect just the shadows or just the highlights with hue saturation for this. If I come over here to the luminosity thing, again, you saw with the other one, I can affect the luminosity of this very easily without affecting the color in any way at all. And like actually adding a little bit of luminosity to this, taking just a hint of saturation out. And she's actually looking maybe a little hot here. So maybe we pull that back down a little bit that way, but it's looking a lot better than just what the original shot was for that. So it's a quick, easy way to do the color correction. And I use this for just about everything for that. I see John is asking, do I use the gray eyedropper to color correct for that? The gray eyedropper, what he's talking about here is you have a black, a gray, and a white point eyedropper. So we come over here to color curves, and let's reset this, and let's reset this one. We come over here to color curves. What I have to do is I have to pick a point I would want to set as gray. So I could click here and do that. That kind of helps. The background now becomes gray, but she's looking kind of blue to me for that. So I don't use this a whole lot for that, but it's something that one could if you had something that you thought was exactly gray, or you could reset this and click on the black and maybe it's something that should be exactly black. Well, that didn't really affect that much. So you can kind of do this, but what these things are based on, I have to remember how to bring up the settings. There's a way to do the auto settings, and I haven't practiced that for a while. So I don't want to, here we go, auto options. So what you're doing is you're basically just coming up with, you're using these things here that have been set in as basic things with Photoshop. That's what these things are leveraging on that. And gosh, I have to practice that technique again, because Lisa Carney has a great way for matching color grading from one shot to another that uses that. But no, I don't use the gray eyedropper tool for that very much. The one thing I will say is when I'm color correcting, since we're color correcting, and let's just talk about RGB, we have 3 legs of the stool: red, green, and blue. And if you think about it, you have a stool that's got 3 legs, and you want to level it out. If you try to cut down all 3 legs, you just wind up with a shorter and shorter stool that may or may not be level by now. But by the time you're done, you've kind of chopped all the legs off, and you don't have much of a stool left anymore. So what you want to do is try to do your color correction in the simplest way possible, and only adjust 2 out of the 3 channels for this. So what I'm talking about here is, like, I might come over here to red, and I might decide she's a little too red. So let's pull a little bit of red out. And then I would go to blue and maybe add some blue or whatever to do that. But I wouldn't come over here to green now and then change green as well, because that's the 3rd leg of the stool. And I'm trying to get a balance between these 3 colors. So I would try to keep the approach in a simpler thing like that. And that is one thing that I really am a firm believer in. I've seen people where they've got adjustments and they try to make it, your curve adjustment, something really complex like this. And for me, you're just asking for problems, because like now you're getting shifts here, you're getting banding in the background and stuff like that. The more complex and more wobbly you make your adjustments, the harder it is to know how to finesse it and dial in what you want. So really try to keep it as simple as approach as possible for that. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next technique here. And there is, here we go. One of my favorite techniques for working on masks for adjusting masks is to use the dodge, burn, and blur tools on the mask to adjust the mask. So in this case, we have this shot here. It's a pinup shot photographed by a friend, Rick Miller. And this one's from quite a while ago. Rick used to work for Adobe. He was one of the evangelists going around and talking about Photoshop, and that was how we met when he did a presentation for APA quite a while ago for that. So he was very kind to give me the shot to do. And so what I did was, suppose we want to strip her out and put her against white. So, okay, so I went through, made a pen path for her, copied it in, and like, okay, great, now we got her in white. But as you can see, we kind of got some mistakes with the mask here. So this is where that burn, dodge, and blur tool on the mask really works, because like, okay, we've got to choke this in a little bit. For that, the traditional way would be maybe use the brush tool, go to the brush tool, and I can paint black on my mask, and I can carefully go in. I'm going to set flow up to 100% here. Come on, B. I can carefully go in and try to very carefully trace around here and go do that. But that's going to be very time consuming for that. And a lot of times you have to move quickly. And also, like, if you got a whole lot of stuff to do, you want to be as efficient as possible for that. So I'm going to make sure I'm clicked on this. And this is where I can use the dodge, burn, and blur tools. In fact, one of the things I've done is I've set up my keyboard shortcuts. So if you guys can see here, 0 gives me dodge tool, or letter O gives me dodge tool and burn tool. I turned it off with the sponge tool. So I can hit O. No, I don't want a selection. I want to hit O on the keyboard, and I'm on the dodge tool. Shift O is burn tool. That's what it was doing. It was very big burn tool. I don't want very big burn tool. Anyway, so we come over here, we got burn tool, and I can quickly paint around here and like there. I haven't had to be careful. I can be sloppy about how I do it, and I bring that in. Suppose I decide like, oh, wait a minute. you've done that, but now it's too hard. That's where the blur tool comes in. And you can change the opacity of this, right? I'm going to set this up to 100% here, the strength of it to 100%, so it moves more quickly. But the blur tool is going to bring back shades of gray. So if we look just here, blur tool is introducing shades of gray. The dodge tool or the burn tool is making more of the grays black. Shift 0, the dodge tool, is making more of the whites and more of the grays white. So by working back and forth here, we can go through and we can very quickly come here and creep this in as needed and very quickly stroke all around here and clean up these edges here and go around here like this. So there's no way I can move this quickly if I were using a brush tool to do this. And the edges of a mask almost always need to be finessed visually as opposed to universally. I could use the select and mask tool for this, which I use a lot. I could use it for this, but that's going to be a universal adjustment. And as you know, sometimes one part of the image might be more in focus than another part of the image. And the edge of the mask is going to have to reflect how hard or soft the focus is in that area. So this burn, dodge, and blur tool gives me a great way to work around that. One thing I want to emphasize is that if I do this, you see I kind of round out these corners here a little bit. And that's one thing to just be cognizant of. It's not a fatal thing because now I can come over here. I can hit B for the brush tool. I'm going to put white as my foreground tool and just hand paint in a little bit there to bring back a more natural looking edge there. But I just have to do that in a very small little area, wherever I see these little rounded out corners happening for that. So it's pretty quick to do. And if you know that's going to come up, you're already prepared for it. So you can come in and clean those things up with that. But aside from that, it's a very quick way to get around this. So I use the burn, dodge, and blur tool a lot. I'm asking for that. It's not the end all be all for that, but it is really super helpful for that. While I'm masking, I also want to talk a little bit about a technique. It's an old technique, something we call channel pulls. And channel pulls for masks have been really super helpful. I still use them a lot for that. So with this tool, with this thing here, suppose we want to mask out something like this. This would be really complex to try to paint a mask around all these little things here. It's going to be really difficult to capture all that detail with painted mask or with the path or whatever like that. The pen tool is a great way for making a mask. I use the pen tool a lot. Or for something like this, the pen tool, maybe around the pot if we needed the pot. I think when we're using this shot, this is something worked on for a long time ago. It was supposed to be some sort of a funky prop in the background or something. So we weren't going to use the pot. We were just going to use this plant and have it look like it was coming out of the ground, whatever for that. So the channel pull thing is where you look at the channels, and I need to change the panel options on here so you can see these nice and big. And okay, so we have the red, the green, the blue channel. And so we're going to look to see which one has the best contrast between what we want to keep and what we want to lose. Now it looks like the blue channel does a pretty good job. So it has pretty good contrast between what we want to keep and what we want to lose. We're going to pull this down to here to make a copy of this. That's why it's called channel pull, because we're pulling the channel down and make a copy of it. I'm going to bring up image adjustments, curves. Command M is the shortcut for that. And I'm going to bring that curves. This is where I use those white and black eyedroppers, John. So I'm going to click on the white eyedropper. I'm going to click in here. I want to force that to white. I'm going to click on the black eyedropper. I'm going to force that to black. Now I can kind of push these around a little bit to try to get more or less detail for the hit. I'm getting a little bit of gray creeping in here. I'm going to push some more white in for this, but this is kind of what we're working for. And I'm really just thinking the areas around our bush here. This is looking really pretty good. Now, when I can't zoom in when I have for some reason, won't let me zoom in when I'm doing that. One thing you have to look at is it's not going to be perfect in these areas here. So we're going to have to come up with another solution for these, maybe paint these in. But for all this stuff here, which is going to be really difficult to mask out, it's done a pretty good job for those things. So let me go to the dodge tool. Let me go to the dodge tool, dodge around here. So we just back that off more closely there. Now I'm going to go to the lasso tool. I'm going to do this. While I'm doing the lasso tool, I have the regular lasso tool, but I'm holding down the option key, which gives me the ability to treat this as if it were the magnetic one, but I can also draw around and make shapes like that if I want. Okay, so I've selected around that. I'm going to invert that for the moment. Set my foreground color to white. Fill the rest of the mask with white. So I've gotten rid of everything I don't want to get rid of. That's quick. I'm going to invert this because white will keep and black will hide. Now I turn this into a selection by command click. Come back up here. Go to our layers. I'm going to copy this layer here. I already had a mask for this, so I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, that one turned off. And now I'm going to click on the add a mask icon, and there. We've got this masked out really pretty quickly. And channel pulls are used a lot. As you can see, we lost some of this stuff here, but this is where we could easily go in with the brush tool and fix those things. For that, you just have to pay attention to those areas here, and I know you're gonna have to do that. You might have a couple of these ones where you've adjusted differently for different parts. That's something I do a lot. Again, I want to move quickly for this, so I just wanted to show you that channel pull thing for this. So that works out really pretty well for this. Let me see. The other thing that Photoshop has, which is a brand new thing, and let's see how well that works for this. Come on, get rid of that mask. No, I'm not. I want to get rid of the mask. Come on, click on the mask and get rid of the mask. Delete the mask. Okay, so we're back to here. So it's something else that Photoshop has got, and a lot of you guys might talk about, like, why do I need more advanced versions of Photoshop or whatever like that? They got some cool stuff going on, like an AI-driven version of Select Subject, which actually does a really pretty good job. I can't show you that yet because it's not in a release thing yet. But the one thing I want to show you here is objects. Why is object select tool not showing up? Object select tool got put up in here. Okay. So the object selection tool, quite often I find it down here where I have to add it to that, but it showed up in here. So if you see, as I hover over this thing, it's guessing about what I want as an object. So, okay, let's select that. Come on. It takes a moment, and voila, it makes a selection. Let's click on that, and gosh, let's get off of that tool for a moment, because the black flashing back and forth is bothering me. But look at this. It didn't do a great job around here, but it did a good job with our trunk for that. So this is where you could combine masks for this. So for instance, let's select this. Let's make a selection out of the mask that we just did with our channel pull thing. And then we're going to invert that mask. So we're going to go select invert. Where is it? All right, select inverse. The problem with knowing keyboard shortcuts is you forget the menu thing. So now I'm going to go to the brush tool. I'm going to paint black, and I can paint black around these areas here. And now I can get the trunk cleaned up, and I can quickly come around here and clean up around the area here. So I'm able to combine different masking techniques easily together to get a pretty good mask that's going to work for putting this into a background or whatever I want to do. So that's a really cool thing with the object selection tool for that. Let's see. We've done that. I think we have time for like 2 more things. So I'm going to show you blending modes. And there's some cool stuff with blending modes. I'm going to open up 2 examples. This one, and I'm going to open up this one. Okay, so this one here, this is an example I set up just to show you what blending modes do, give you an idea about what the blending modes are doing. I wanted 3 very different kinds of images so you can kind of get a good range of that. This one over here on the left is my daughter Katie when she was about 10 years old. She cringes every time I show this image now, but I think it's just a really cute image of her. She's now an engineer working for Gala Wines, doing some great stuff. So we're very proud of her for that. But anyway, when you look at blending modes, they're over here. You have all these different kinds of blending modes and all that stuff. So I wanted to kind of get an idea about give you guys a visual idea about what each blending mode is doing for that. So to do that, I set this up and then I divided it up. I made a selection going across, horizontal selection, dividing the top and the bottom. And then what I did was I set up adjustment layers. So one is using the blending mode thing. The other one is using normal mode, but it uses an adjustment layer to create that. So if we just turn this off for a moment, I'm just going to turn this off for a moment. I want to show you what the blending modes do. So we have normal, which of course is your normal thing. Darken, these are all going to be ones that darken your image in some way for that. So you can see everything's getting darker here in different kind of ways. Lighten, everything in here is going to lighten your image in some kind of way. These ones, overlay, soft light, all these things, these are contrast enhancing. 50% gray is neutral. Anything lighter than 50% gray lightens the image. Anything darker than 50% gray darkens the image. So that's really important to think about with this. So it's a contrast enhancing thing. These get into some pretty esoteric kind of things. I have a great use for this difference mode, but I'll show that to you in a little bit. And then you have hue, saturation, color, luminosity. Color uses hue and saturation. Hue and saturation obviously are using just those colors. And the luminosity is just using the lightness and darkness. So in this particular case, we had this set for overlay blending, and you can see it's adding contrast to the image in a really easy way. For the curve, if I bring this up, the curve is just a standard S curve for that. So my goal was when I found a way that we couldn't see the difference between these, I had recreated the curve that creates that effect. So that's what overlay does. It's contrast enhancing. Soft light, what would soft light be? Soft light is a more gentle version. So it's not quite as strong as that. Screen is just lightening the image up. So it's just pulling it up and lightening the image up for that. That's really useful if you want to bring in something like if you've shot smoke, if you have white smoke against a black background, it's a great way to add smoke, to add dust to something, light rays to something, lightning. If you wanted to all sorts of ways, whatever you can use screen blending for adding all kinds of really cool effects for that. Then you have multiply. Multiply is the opposite. It's just darkening things. So multiply blending is really useful for like adding shadows, all kinds of stuff where you want just the darkening of the thing to come on for that. Other uses for that is like adding texture. So if we add in, if we put this on overlay, you can see we just adding texture into here, what like that. But those are what the basic blending modes do for that. So they're really, really super useful for a lot of things here. Retouchers use blending modes a lot for stuff. So it's something that you really can get a lot of power for and learn a lot about how to work with on that. Another esoteric thing I told you, difference blending mode is sort of an esoteric kind of thing, but there's great use for that. So this shot here, what I just did was I took this white phone and moved it. This was a shot I worked on for Hunter Freeman for Motorola several years ago. And it was part of a great campaign for this. And Hunter shoots these things great in a great way, but you can see we're adding all kinds of layers and effects and different things to build up each particular thing for that. He really crafts his lighting, and it's a lot of fun to work with him. But suppose we had this phone and like, oh, we had the phone with a different middle piece here. We have the same shot for it, but we just need that to replace here. So how are you gonna replace this phone with this phone and move it over here and get it to be exact? I can move it in for this. I can try to roughly guess, like maybe that's kind of close, but it's not going to be perfect. I can do a thing where I know I'm going to invert that value, and then I will cut the opacity down to 50% gray and turn this around. But again, that gets to be hard to tell exactly what's what. For that, it's like, okay, maybe that's not what I want to do. For that, what I found is the easiest thing to do is set the blending mode on this to difference. Now, difference, wherever things are the same, it shows up as black. And wherever they're different, you get this sort of a rainbow color effect based on how different it is. So let's zoom in and pull this around. I'll use my arrow keys to nudge this in. And then look, we got confirmation. When it turns black, it's in exactly the same space. Set this back to normal blending. And we turn it on off. And there's absolutely no difference. So really quickly and easily, I'm able to nail that position for that. This is something we use an awful lot, where it's, oh, you've composited this thing in. It wasn't a smart object. The smart object trick is even easier for this. But if you don't have it as a smart object, or if I'm working on something where you've got to replace a head, somebody like, oh, it's a similar head position, but we like the smile better in this shot. Can you just put that smile in this shot? Well, you can line it up and get the head in the right position and the right size and orientation using something like lining up the eyes or the eyes and the nose or something like that to get it lined up. And then you've got this thing in really close perspective for that. So that really helps a whole lot. That I'm not seeing any more questions pop up. So I hope I'm not going to where you guys are getting completely lost about things. But another thing I wanted to show you are what I call 3 curves for checking your work. And one of the things that's really important, especially for retouchers, is why is this opening Skype? Goodness gracious. I wanted to open these things up in Photoshop. And for some reason, it started opening Skype. That was really strange. Anyway, one of the things that's really important is if you're a retoucher, to be able to check your work to make sure there's nothing in the shot that's going to come back and bite you for that. Nothing like having a client say, excuse me, but we went to press and some lines showed up or something showed up we didn't see. Why didn't you catch that? So this is where those curves are really helpful. And I did write an article for SLR Lounge about this. So in this case, we have a lot of dark shadow detail. And we want to see into the shadows, see if there's any kind of a mistake in the shadows. So with this case, this is a curve where I just push the curve up and lighten it up to a great extent. And then we can look in here, and now we can see where there's spots, like something here, spots here. This, I think, was something out of the frame. I forget what happened with that, but you can look through here and just see different spots and things and see if there's any edges or whatever showing up. So this is where I circled the different spots and things. Like all these things are things that I would want to clean up, and they're deep in the shadow detail. They're really hard to see. But just because they're hard to see doesn't mean they're not there, and we don't want to clean them up. So that's one curve where you just lighten it up to an extreme amount. The next thing would be where we've got all this light detail and stuff, and we want to see what's going on. So there's a curve where we darken it quite a lot. And that shows us all these spots down here So this is all stuff where they walked all over the seamless paper all day. And like here, you don't really notice it that much. Just like, oh, it's just some paper texture. But those spots are there, and they're things, again, we want to clean up and get rid of for that. So it's just a curve you put on to darken everything. It exaggerates your image. And what you're doing is, pay no attention to the idea that you got banding here, because this is just caused by the exaggeration for that. But you're just looking for problems that you want to do. And quite often I will throw a curve on and lighten it and darken it and all that. I was working on some movie poster stuff where we had a woman looking out a window in a dark paneled room. Really need to see all that detail in the dark paneled room. Make sure all the effects layers and things, the edges and masks and things were correct, because you certainly don't want to be printing the billboards and suddenly run into a problem you didn't catch for that. And then the last curve I'll show you, I think this will take us just about to our time when you guys get for questions. Last curve I'll show you is what we call solarization curves. The solarization curves are really useful for really exaggerating the heck out of things and seeing problems come up. So a solar curve does something like this. It's just wild looking curves for that. And I've saved, they're kind of a pain to make. So I've saved my solar curves. I have it in one of the settings as a preset here for that. So it's just pulling the curve up and down, up and down, up and down. I've seen people make them different ways. I don't think it makes a huge difference exactly how you make it, but the whole idea is you just get this up and down, because it's just exaggerating the heck out of things. And this is where you can see, like, it's really great for seeing sensor spots in skies. So here we see the spots here. There are a couple of things going here. There's some over here where we want to clean up. Some little transitions here we're going to want to clean up for that. I don't worry about stuff like this. I might go back and double check that to see if there's a problem there. Certainly, you might see some specks or whatever show up here, but this is really great for seeing problems with smooth areas for that. So those are the three curves for checking out color or checking out your image and making sure that you got everything done right. Do we have any questions, or do we have time for one or two more things to show?
I think there was a question from before, if we can go back almost a little.
Sure.
It was from Jeff. Best practice to mask a smart object in the main working file or the smart object file?
Oh, Jeff, that's a great question. And I find personally that's going to vary based on what you're doing. So for some reason, my personal preference tends to be to make my object a smart object and then have the mask with it. So when I'm compositing something, I'm always adjusting stuff in context. And what I'm thinking about is, there was a poster I worked on a long time ago. It was something for like Rise of the Phoenix or something like that. And so they had the damaged plane in the desert, and they had the crew standing near the plane. And there were three crew members standing back towards the back of the plane in this desert scene. And I had masked them all out using exactly the same settings, because when they give it to you, you got all these separate shots. First you make your masks and do that. And when we put them into the background, the art director kept saying, the mask around the guy on the left is too sharp. And I'm thinking, like, it's exactly the same mask quality, mask edge, as the one to the right of him. And I would zoom in, like, no, it's exactly the same softness for that. So, like, what's the art director talking about? Then I realized in that particular one, that figure was darker figure against a lighter part of the background. So the visual contrast between the background and the subject, the object we masked out, was greater visual contrast, making the mask edge look harsher. So the context changed, and that meant I had to adjust the mask based on that context. So that really kind of set my preference for, I tend to like to have the layer mask editable right there, because otherwise I would go open up the smart object, soften the mask, and then bring it back in. Is that right? Nope, not quite right. Okay, go back and forth and do that. And I would find that sort of a lot of back and forth, where I could just easily take my dodge and burn tool and blur tool and go around it in the context and do that. That said, there are a lot of times, like with those phones, where we know exactly what that mask, we're going to want that mask to look like. And yeah, in those cases, I probably would mask them out and have the mask embedded in the smart object for that, knowing I could open up the smart object and change it if need be, but I'm probably not going to need to. And it would just keep my file thing clear. So I don't have a particular best practice for that. It's more personal preference, but it's all going to be based on what it is you're trying to do. Does anybody want to see another couple of techniques for that? Yeah, I'm seeing Patrick with thumbs up. So I'm going to go back to the object select tool and talk a little bit about blending modes with this as well. So I'm trying to close this panel. For some reason, it doesn't want to respond that great. So this is the shot I did when I get to travel. I don't shoot a lot, but I love to wander around and take a day to just wander around and photograph. So I think I was in I think this was in Houston, I think. But I found this shot and I found this building. I thought this whole thing was interesting. The shapes and the textures and stuff of it was really interesting. And when I was working on an article for the guys at Pro EDU, they had released a set of textures. Like, here's some ways you can use textures for this. So what I did here, this is a dark green texture for this, and I've set this up for, come on, right. Okay. Sometimes my layers get funky and they don't like me. So I just put this on. This is a smart object, so this is just this one thing. So nothing fancy happening in the smart object here, but experiment around with different kinds of blending modes for this. And I wound up settling on multiply because I really like the way that it just darkened things down for this. I have color curves here, adjustment. So this color curves is desaturating the image here because I wanted it to be a black and white thing. So that's why the color's not affected. Although I do kind of like that green color for that. Anyway, so this is one way of using textures for this. You can bring stuff in, you can set it on overlay or blending mode or any different blending mode or whatever like that, add some layer stuff. But one of the things was kind of like, okay, my older daughter, not the one who's the engineer, but my older daughter, when she's looking at it, like, oh, it's really cool, but you kind of need to make the building stand out a little bit more. Like, okay, that would mean I'd want to mask this building out. And masking this building is kind of a bother to do all this stuff to make that out. So in this case, I'm going to click on here and our object selection tool, W, there we go. Our object selection tool here. Let's see how that works. Boom, that did a great job. So if I want to use this, I'm thinking I like the building looking kind of stark and dark and stuff like this. I would want to like maybe change just the background. So I had the building selected. I'm going to Command Shift I and invert the selection. Now I'm going to add I'm going to come up here. I'm going to add a adjustment layer, curves adjustment layer. You see the layer mask as black protecting the building. I mean, look at this. I can select just that part. Wow. It gets a little distracting, but that's actually a pretty cool idea. Wherever it thinks it can see a different object, seeing a different object. Anyway, so here I can do something like this. I can make that building stand out more, or it definitely doesn't want to be darker. It definitely wants that background wants to be lighter. So for that. So the object selection tool is just really great. And I'm using a texture layer textures can be any sort of thing that you have. I shoot, I went to Puerto Rico 4 or 5 years ago with a group of photographers and had a lot of fun wandering around shooting. And I kept shooting close-ups of walls, of textures and things like that. And one of them was like, you are such a retoucher. Retouchers love to shoot textures because we're using them in all sorts of stuff for that. And it's really a great way of adding sort of a gritty look to it, or just the right kind of look to things for that. Another use for textures is, where's the shot? Looking for a shot. Oh, okay. Let's come back to our shot of McKenna. So another use for texture stuff would be, suppose we've retouched on this, but we've kind of lost some texture in her skin. We want to bring up some textures for that. One of the things that's really useful is to use the high pass filter and blending modes for that. So in this case, I'm going to select all these layers here because we've done all of our retouch and stuff. I'm just going to select all the layers here. I'm going to hold down Option and hit Command E and merge all those into a copy for this. So this is a copy layer. I'm going to make it a smart object just for giggles. So come over here, convert to smart object, make it a smart object. That means I can go back and play with it however I want. I'm going to come over here and run the high pass filter. The high pass filter is kind of a cool filter. It looks for, it's going to set your base part of the image to neutral gray, and it's going to, based on the radius, look for the differences in the textures and stuff and give you some sort of thing like that. This is sort of close to what you're getting when you do frequency separation. The high layer would be something kind of like this, although it's not an exact thing. So I do not recommend using high pass filter when you're doing frequency separation. There's some people with those techniques, but it's not accurate. So I don't recommend it for that. But for this, adding textures or whatever, just pulling textures out, this is a really useful thing. So as you can see, the smaller the radius, the smaller the detail, or we're not capturing the smaller details that much. The higher the radius, we're capturing more of the smaller details a bit. So let's just say this looks good. So we're going to run that. And now it's 50% gray. And we've got that. We're going to set this to overlay blending. And let's see. So this is a great way for adding some sharpening. You can do that for overlay blending. Let's go real extreme for linear light. And you can see in here, it's adding in a lot of texture in that. So let's see, suppose we wanted to add in this kind of texture for that. And overlay is not enough. Linear light is too much. Hard light's almost never complementary. So with these things, I either use overlay soft light or linear light. Well, let's go with linear light. Let's set the opacity on this. Another trick is if you're in the move tool, V gets you to the move tool. If you hit like 5 on the keyboard, it will set your opacity to your opacity thing for 50%. So you can go up and down or whatever for this, but let's just say that's 50%. And now let's hold down the Option key, add a layer mask, brush tool, white's our foreground color, and now we can just brush in the texture where we want it. And if I set my flow down to something low, I can just gently brush it out of these areas here, gently brush it in here, and kind of get a lot of finesse and texture. So I can make her skin look sharper with that way. It's very rare I would want to sharpen skin, but if if we really needed something where we've just lost all the texture, I would want to very subtly bring some texture into the skin for that. So I use this high pass filter a lot for sharpening up images. I was just using it on working on some portraits a friend, Emily Teague, shot. They're not ready to show yet. But in these cases, I wanted to like bring more focus to the model's hair and her eyes and her face away from the other objects. So I ran a high pass filter, you put it on overlay, and then just brushed it in those areas just to bring more detail and sharpness and focus to that area for that. So, you know, we've talked a little bit more about using overlay blending and bring in textures and all kinds of cool things for that. I see we have about 15 minutes left. So do we want to let everybody come back on and see if they have any particular questions?
Yeah, just stop sharing your screen.
Okay, I will stop sharing.
Because then you'll see everyone unless you want to keep your screen.
Well, if we go back to the screen, we can always go back to the screen.
There was.
I love Nick Naka's little thumbnail thing, staring up at his dog. The dog thinks he's in his rightful place, right, Nick?
There are two questions. Jeff Bynum, do you want to come on and ask? Do you want me to ask?
Just simply, do you have any tips for stray hair removal, particularly against the background?
Oh yeah. One of the things that I do recommend a lot is, I know it's not always possible, but one thing that really helps is when photographers shoot like just the background from the same camera position. If you shoot just the background and then you shoot the subject against the background, now I've got something I can paint in to get rid of it. That's the easiest way to do that, to get rid of stray hairs. If you don't have that, then it would be using the spot healing tool, the healing brush, the clone stamp. On occasion, you can use just the paint brush for that. That can be really useful for that. It's going to all depend on what the background is like. That's also where frequency separation can be really helpful, because if you set it the frequency separation the correct way, all the stray hairs would just show up like on the high texture layer. And then all you have to do is clone the texture. You're not worried about the color and the tonality because you've separated those out from that. So sometimes that works for that, but there isn't any one method for it because the circumstances vary so much. On the one of that, the shot of that girl where we did the portrait work on that, the background for her is all these different blurry out of focus colors. So it's kind of difficult to do to get that, because you have to kind of recreate that nature of that background as much as possible for that. So with that, you know, I start off with, again, I like the simplest tool first. So I tried spot healing brush, then I went to the healing brush, and then I might go to clone stamp or paintbrush. And with that, there wasn't any texture in that background to worry about. So I could do more with the paintbrush than I normally would. But the paintbrush won't have the texture in there. So then you have to play games to get some texture back. So I wish I had a cleaner answer for you.
There's a question. Cameron, do you want to ask your question or you want me to read it? I'll read it. For accuracy, if buying the new Mac Studio computer to replace an aging iMac, what monitor do you suggest for maximum speed and color fidelity?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Personally, I have an NEC monitor. I have a 27-inch one. I'm looking at getting a new one to replace this one, a little bit bigger one for that. So I really like the NEC monitors for that. The thing I like about the NEC monitors is every single monitor you use has to be calibrated and profiled. I don't care what they tell you is, calibrated out of the box. Like, don't believe them. Every single one has to be calibrated and profiled. And so I have, it used to be called X-Rite, but now they call themselves Calibrite. I have their measuring device. And with NEC, they have their own software, SpectraView. And when you use the measuring puck with their software, it feeds back through a USB connection to the monitor. It feeds back to the hardware in the monitor and calibrates as much as possible of it via hardware. So the lookup table from the video card is doing less work on the calibration and more work on just presenting the image. So it gives me a really well calibrated, very smooth and accurate image for that. BenQ also has those abilities for that. And I've heard a lot of great stuff with BenQs. I don't have a BenQ monitor. I haven't personally used them, but I've heard a lot of great things with that. There's, I can't remember the name of, there's a high-end brand. I always have trouble remembering how to pronounce it, and the name escapes me at the moment for that. Those are really expensive monitors, and they're great monitors if somebody else is paying for it. But if it's your own monitor, like as a business person, I'm always trying to think about return on investment. So we're paying twice as much, get me a 5% increase in return on investment, probably not worth it. So I don't know if I would go with this high-end ones. Apple has brand new monitor they talked about. I don't know that great deal much about it, but it's got some really great features to it. But the new high-end studio Apple monitor coming out, it's really expensive. So that would be a big leap for me to think is justified for the price. The bottom line thing you want to look at is, first you want to look at what the color gamut for the monitor is. Most of the monitors will brag about, we cover 100% of sRGB. And that's like saying I can get up out of bed in the morning. Like for some of us, that's a victory. For some people, getting out of bed in the morning is a victory. But when it comes to a monitor, I want something that can perform a little better than that. sRGB is a color model that was based back in the 90s on the cheap low-end Windows monitors for that. So it's like really the lowest common denominator. And if your monitor can't cover that, it absolutely shouldn't have it. But Adobe RGB is a wider color space. You see more saturated reds, greens, and blues. And so you want to have a monitor that will cover as much of Adobe RGB as possible. You can find good ones that cover like 98, 99% of Adobe RGB, and that's really good to go with. A new color space that's being talked a lot about is P3. Apple uses that a lot. That's really more oriented towards, I understand that's more oriented towards a video color space. It's not quite as big as Adobe RGB, but again, you might only find the specs for that because the color monitor manufacturers try to make that information difficult to find. But you really want to try to make sure that the color gamut is set as wide as possible for that. The resolution on the monitor for me doesn't matter a great deal. The NEC monitor I got when I had a old Mac Pro tower, the old aluminum ones, from 2010. And my video card couldn't handle a 4K monitor. So I didn't get a 4K monitor when I bought this monitor for that, because it would be a waste of time for that. And I find this works just fine for that. So I don't think it has to be a super 8K resolution monitor. For me, I haven't seen an advantage for that yet. But really, you want that color gamut. And if possible, the hardware calibration really helps for that. You still need the colors, you still need the measuring device, but that hardware calibration is really, really helpful for the accuracy of your monitor.
There's a question from ATN. Are there cases where you just work on the raw files, or you are so used to working with layers in Photoshop that you only use that system?
Well, I get sent a wide range of images from my clients for that. So some clients will send me TIFFs they've processed. Some will send me raw files. When it comes to the processor, I have some clients that like Capture One and some that like Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. So I usually want to try to start off in the same starting space my clients are. Like if they've been viewing this set with a certain white point and contrast and exposure, and they send me the raw file without any of those settings, I'm guessing like, wait a minute, what do you want the skin tone to look like? I might say we're going to dial it in, we're going to finesse it a little bit more, but I really like to get their starting space for that. But wherever possible, I do like to get the raw file for that. So like when I was working on those corporate headshots, they sent me the raw files. I opened up the raw files, and in some cases, like, okay, I need to open up the shadow detail because they had a dark suit. We're going to want to see a little more detail with a dark suit. So open up the shadow detail a little bit. I would open that up as a smart object into Photoshop and then work on the retouching stuff there. So I don't do a great deal of finessing in the raw processor. I don't get in and like, I have some friends who will like use Capture One or Lightroom, and they use a lot of layers in there, and they use a lot of adjustments and stuff to tweak things in. My workflow isn't where I get asked to do that a lot, so I don't use those tools a lot, but they are very useful tools. So I can use them if need be, but I do kind of like getting the raw file and what their starting space is as a place to work from for that as much as possible. So I don't know if that answered Etienne's question, but I hope it did.
We'll find out. Any other questions?
Oh, yes. Etienne says I did answer.
Okay, great.
Good.
Yes.
I'm always wondering, like, when there are no questions, like, did everybody get everything I said, or like they so like, okay, you lost me 10 minutes in, and I did a workshop in Taiwan, and it was supposed to be an 8-hour workshop, and the first day was on beauty retouching. I kept asking people for questions. Nobody was asking questions. Nobody was asking questions. So by lunchtime, I had run through like 3/4 of my material. Like, uh-oh. And then finally, after lunch, I got them to practice, and then they started asking a bunch of questions. So sometimes it's just getting people to ask the questions, because I want to make sure I'm addressing everything they want to know.
You're getting, you have some happy attendees.
Well, that's good news.
Oh, wait, we have one more question, John Travis. Do you ever use
Luminosity masks.
Thank you.
Yes, I use luminosity masks a lot. Luminosity masks are basically where you're using the grayscale information in the channels to create a mask. And so if you remember when I was showing how we would use the channel pull to make the mask for that bush, that's a luminosity mask. It's just not one that people normally think of for that. I don't use the plugins or the extensions where they generate these different luminosity masks a lot, because I'm so well versed. I've been doing this for 30 years, over 30 years now. So I'm so well versed in looking through the channels and getting the information I need and pulling that out, that I make my own luminosity mask for that. And it wasn't until a few years ago I heard everybody talking about luminosity masks that I realized, like, oh, that's a special thing. For me, that was just commonplace for that. But I do use that a lot. Like, one thing I will do is, didn't get a chance to show it, but I will, one of the ways of adding a glow to a person's face in a portrait or a beauty shot is to make a luminosity mask based on, usually I use the blue channel. I push the black value of the blue channel up about 1/3 of the way, where I'm trying to isolate the highlights in the face. And then I use that to add a glow to the skin for that. That's really similar to using those blend if channels, the blend if sliders that I showed in the beginning. It's just a little bit different way of getting to the similar endpoint for that. So that's one way of doing it. Another way would be to, like, if you have somebody with dark hair and you really want to bring out the highlights in their hair, a luminosity mask where you're trying to find a way of some of the grayscale value in the red, green, or blue channel to isolate the highlights in the hair, and then add something like a curve adjustment layer to brighten up those highlights and make them pop more. That's another way of using a luminosity mask. Landscape photographers, I understand, use luminosity masks a lot to kind of add depth to the image and control the depth of what's happening for that. So I do use them a lot. I don't have a plugin or extension, whatever, that generates them for me.
We have time just for a couple more questions. There was one from John, who just said, can you show us that blue channel technique you just described in a beauty retouch?
Okay, sure.
And Jack had a question. If you have a lot of shots to do quickly of people, client chose too many, do you ever use a portrait filter to add some global batch adjustments to get you closer to where you want to be?
No, I don't. When I went to, I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I think I shared the screen the wrong way. I'm going to start it over again. If I don't do it the right way, then you guys don't see everything I'm working on. So can you guys see the entire screen now? Can you see the layers panel over here?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, good. Because I've done this where I shared it the wrong way. I'm like, we don't see what you're doing. So I want to show that technique. This is an article I wrote. I think it was for SLR Lounge. If you go to my website, dunbardigital.com, in the tutorials and articles or videos and articles thing, there's a link to this video or a link to this article for that. But we want to add a little bit of a nice glow to the shot. This was shot by Scott Nathan, who does a lot of beauty photography, and he shot this model kind of an homage to Liz Taylor sort of thing. So we want to add just a little bit of a glow to her face, just to kind of make it give that angelic kind of look. So if we look at the red, the green, and the blue channels, I'm looking for the channel that seems to have the best contrast between the shadows and the highlights of the face. So there's so much red in skin tone. The red channel is going to be really super light in all the skin tone. Green is pretty good. Blue tends to have the best contrast here. So sometimes I use green, but most of the time I'm using blue. So I'm going to pull this down and make a copy of my blue channel. Try it one more time. There we go. We have a copy of the blue channel here. I'm going to come over here to image adjustment curves because I love curves. I've joked that Lisa Carney, a good friend, uses levels a lot. She said Lisa loves levels. The closest I can come is Dennis thinks curves are cute. So I don't know if that works or not, but we're going to use curves for this. I'm going to pull the block point over here, and I'm just visually looking for how much am I isolating the highlights, the lighter tones in her face. Usually it's about a third of the way over, but we can go more, we can go less. That's just going to depend on how strong you want that to be. So we're going to call this good. We're going to say, okay. Now I'm going to load this as a selection. I'm going to come back over here to layers. I'm going to add a new layer. We're going to call this glow. We're going to call it glow. And now I'm going to make white my foreground color. I have an active selection. You can see little crawling ants here. I'm going to hold down Option click or Option delete and fill that with white. And so I'm adding that. That's really too strong. Let's go over here and make that, let's make that soft light. And there. This is that technique for that. It's using the information in the channel. So it tends to be kind of a crisper look than if I just painted it in. If I just painted it in, that would be really super soft and all that. And then I can add a layer mask to this and say, I don't want it in her, go to my brush tool, say, I don't want that showing up on her shoulders. I just want it in her face. I'm just going to mask it out here. I'm going to turn my flow up to 100%. I'm just going to make sure I've masked it out all up here. And because this is all set, this was filled in through a selection. This already has all of our information in that. So that in a quick hit is that technique for using blue channel for that. It's making a luminosity mask for the highlights of our skin and using that as a selection to get an effect. I could add a curve adjustment layer instead of fill it with white. That would be a slightly different effect. If I wanted to lighten it that way, I could blur this and get a little bit softer effect. A lot of different things I can do, but that's basically the quick shortcut for doing that one technique where I'm doing that.
And then just the last question, Jack's question about the if you have a lot of shots.
No, I don't use a portrait filter thing for that. A friend of mine sent me, she's coming up with an AI for doing portrait work. So it's not for high-end stuff. I haven't had a chance to play with that yet, but no, that would be extremely rare for me to use one. When I wrote the book with Katrine, we reviewed 3 of them, and I can't remember which one worked better than the other ones. But the problem is always, once I get it into the portrait, gets that into the thing I'm trying to dial in this stuff, it's hard to go back from there. And they tend to be a little too heavy-handed for what I'm doing. If people want that quick portrait filter look, and that's something they tend to either go to somebody who's not quite as high-end, or they tend to do themselves for that. So the clients are really looking for me to do more high-end stuff for that. So I know I don't do that very much for that, but I do occasionally play with them and see what works. And there's occasionally a job where, like I remember in one case, photographer had photographed a lady in her 80s who wrote a book about romance, finding romance later in life. And she wanted to look like she was in her 30s. And at one point, he just said, like, pull out the stops and let her have what she wants. So like, okay, I found one of those filters, hit it really heavy. She said, oh, that looks wonderful. I love it. Like, okay, fine. You get what you want. I'm providing a service. I'm not the temperamental artist dictating to my clients what they're going to get. So, okay. But it's not something I do very much. Any other questions?
I think that's it. Thank you all so much for joining. It looks like everyone got a lot out of this. Thank you, Dennis, so much for taking the time today. And I guess everyone have a fabulous rest of your weekend. And thank you again.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for coming. And it's good to see a lot of familiar faces, or at least familiar names. I didn't see many faces.
Okay.
All right.
Bye for now. Enjoy.
Bye-bye.